Hello and welcome to the Arctic Beyond. I'm your host Jack Ball. I'm here to bring you all things Arctic and maybe even a little bit beyond. Now this is the first in what will hopefully be a long-running series of in-depth looks into news matters regarding the Arctic. And seeing as it's the new year of 2024, I figure where else to start but looking back at 2023 in review. We can take a look at everything that went down in 2023 regarding the Arctic. And then we can happily move on to all things 2024 and beyond. Now this information comes from NOAA, that's the US federal group looking at atmospheric climatological matters. Every year they do their observations of the Arctic and of course the climate around the world, and they put together a report card for the Arctic each year. So let's take a look at their findings for the Arctic in 2023. Now, it's interesting that they called it a report card. So if we think of this sort of like a report card at school, then in terms of your grades, I'd say that the Arctic has gotten a lot of Fs this year. It's probably not too surprising. I think that generally when people think of how the Arctic is doing, they think not doing too great, and that's pretty accurate. The Arctic is in general not in a quite healthy place. So we are seeing a lot of Fs in 2023. But on the positive side, we can say that they're not the worst Fs that the Arctic has ever gotten. So let's call it a D. Shall we? Let's call 2023 a D for the Arctic. So for example, if we look at the temperature of the Arctic in 2023, it was the 6th warmest year on record for the Arctic in terms of the average air temperature. It was also the year with the 6th least amount of sea ice measured in the Arctic. Now, of course, when we're talking about the Arctic, we have to consider that there are many countries involved, and of course there's a lot of just sea ice. No countries involved, it's just international waters frozen over for either almost all of the year or the entire year. Of course, nowadays it's getting less and less amount of the year that the Arctic is being frozen over. Now I said that it's the 6th warmest. Actually, the summertime was the warmest ever. So if we take the whole year, it was the 6th warmest because the winter was reasonably cool. It wasn't too hot in the wintertime, but the summertime was massively hot across the Arctic. Record-breaking heat waves in the Arctic, and it was the hottest ever recorded. Now, of course, ever recorded, these kind of records go back to about 1970. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about records and ever. Most of the time we're talking 70s and onwards. Very few records go back before the 70s. Along with the fact that, of course, it was very hot, the Arctic is warming quicker than the rest of the world. So climate change, it's happening everywhere, but the Arctic, it's happening even worse. And the acceleration rate, so the amount that the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the Earth, that's also increasing. So normally it's about 2 times faster, the warming in the Arctic, than the rest of the world. So if the rest of the world warms a degree, the Arctic warms 2. But the acceleration rate is increasing as well. For the majority of the Arctic, it's warming, about 2 times faster than the rest of the world. But it varies from place to place. Some places are warming about the same kind of rate as the rest of the Earth. But the place where it's warming the fastest, that's the Norwegian islands of Svalbard. And we'll talk about those islands a lot in future episodes. They are the area which is warming the fastest in the entire world, and that has been warming at about 4 times as high as the rest of the world is warming. Let's say that the world has warmed a degree, then Svalbard probably is warming about 4 degrees in that same time period, which, as you can imagine, is pretty intense and has a lot of severe impacts for those islands and the rest of the Arctic in general. Now, I mentioned Arctic sea ice. Now, Arctic sea ice is in a bit of a tricky situation. It isn't just that the air is warming, as you might expect with climate change and all that, and of course the sea is warming. The real problem is that Arctic sea ice is stuck in what we call a negative feedback loop. Something bad is happening, it's causing the sea ice to melt. More sea ice melting is causing the sea ice to melt even faster, and so on and so on. And what this negative feedback loop is, it's really all about what we call albedo. Now that is about sunlight being reflected back into space. So sunlight, of course, that is a big part of the reason that the Earth is warming. If you know anything about climate change and greenhouse gases, you'll know that it's sunlight coming down to the Earth. It's meant to then leave. Greenhouse gases are trapping the heat in the Earth. And that's pretty much what we all learn in school, isn't it? Obviously, it's not quite that simple, but that's the gist of what we need to know in this case. Now, ice is a fantastic reflector of sunlight, bright white. You know, the sunlight comes down, it just sends it right back. It's like a tennis racket for sunlight. It just comes down, bam, out, back into space and doesn't impact the Earth's temperature. Now, the problem is that, of course, sea ice is melting, and that just leads to open ocean. Open ocean is very dark. It's an extremely good absorber of sunlight and heat. And so as more sea ice is melting and more open ocean is being uncovered, more sunlight comes down, gets absorbed by the ocean warms up, and that causes more sea ice to melt, and that's the negative feedback loop that sea ice is stuck in. And NOAA measured that in 2023. Much of the shallow seas in the Arctic warmed about 2 degrees. Just in 2023, they warmed on average about 2 degrees more than they should. And 2 degrees is a big amount of temperature change in terms of keeping ice frozen. So the worst year for the Arctic by far was 2012. We haven't exceeded 2012 levels. That was a crazy year for the Arctic, but it has been another very bad year in terms of temperature, in terms of sea ice melting. Now, when we talk about the Arctic in 2023, generally most of the countries in the Arctic had, I suppose, what you would call a typical year. So things are getting kind of worse with the climate, but they didn't have a particularly anomalous year. But Canada and Canada's Arctic had a crazy year, especially in the summertime in the Arctic. And we're talking about the wildfires in the Arctic in 2023. Canada had the most severe wildfire season that it's ever had, it's ever recorded. And that's about 100 years, actually, of recording. So it's by far been the most destructive wildfire season on record. Oddly enough, you might expect, you've got Canada right here and you've got Alaska right here. You might expect that Alaska would also have had a particularly bad year in terms of wildfires. But oddly enough, Alaska really avoided the terrible wildfire season that Canada had in 2023. That's actually because of the whole kind of climate effects that we've been seeing. So climate change in the Arctic, it's causing havoc in terms of weather systems and climate systems across the Arctic. And a big problem is that in the summertime in Alaska, it started off the summer as quite wet and quite damp, and Canada started very hot and very dry. But the problem really was that the weather systems just stalled in the Arctic. So, of course, the weather system should be fluid, everything's changing, but they just stalled. And so the weather in Alaska, it just stayed damp and humid and colder. And in Canada, it just stayed hot and dry. And of course, that just made the Canadian Arctic just a big tinderbox. And it just lighted and caused a really terrible wildfire season for Canada in 2023. Now, it might largely seem like it the way I've been talking, but the Arctic isn't just ice. And that's actually been a bit of a problem. Because there is less and less ice, there's more and more green stuff. And you might think that, okay, well, that's fine. What's wrong with more plants? Aren't plants good? I mean, sure, plants are good. But, the Arctic, it's a very delicate ecosystem. And the Arctic is what we call greening. Literally, it's turning green. Now, the way that that's being measured, it's literally just satellite images are measuring the amount of white versus the amount of green when they take the satellite images. And so, yes, it turns out that the ability to say, is that one color or another color? It turns out that's a very valuable scientific tool. Now, in 2023, had the third highest amount of greenness. So the most ever in terms of the satellite images that were taken across the year, the third highest amount of green that was seen. Now, the reason that's bad, when there is more vegetation, vegetation helps heat up the land. Plants, they respire, they generate heat. They also prevent snow from settling and settling into a deep, thick snowpack, which makes it much easier to melt. And so it's much, much harder when plants get a real foothold in the Arctic. It gets much harder for the cold to return and settle and freeze over. And it just kind of helps the Arctic melt. Now, listening to this video, it's been negative. It has been very, very negative, and let's be honest, I think we all expected that. I promise that this channel won't be entirely negativity. There are good stories coming out of the Arctic, especially when it comes to the people of the Arctic. The people of the Arctic are wonderful, and certainly I'll bring you as many great stories as I can. I'll tell you now, there's some good news in 2023. A massive project that was undertaken in Finland was all about the restoration of peatlands. That wasn't just where Peter Jackson filmed the Lord of the Rings films. Peatlands are essentially a kind of bog, sort of like actually in the third Lord of the Rings film. Remember in Return of the King? There's the dead marshes that they go through, and there's the dead preserved bodies. Yeah, those are peatlands. Those are kind of peat bogs. They will preserve any dead bodies that happen to find themselves in there, as well as being a great place to store a dead body that you plan on picking up later. Peatlands are a fantastic carbon sink. They trap huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And you might go to a peat bog and it seems pretty horrible. They are pretty desolate looking and smelling and feeling environments, and that's largely why, especially in the 20th century, peatlands across the world, and in this case in Finland, were just destroyed. They were drained and paved over, turned into farmland, or towns were built on top of them, all sorts of things. Especially there was the post-World War II in Finland and largely across Europe, that peatlands by the hundreds of thousands of square miles were just destroyed, and I think about 90% of Finnish peatland was destroyed. But in the years since, we've realised these are very valuable things for the climate, for ecosystems, for many animals. And so there has been a move to restore peatlands where we can, and Finland in 2023 managed to restore a huge amount of peatland. A series of community organisations mixed with some of the national environmental groups, they managed to rewild about 52,000 hectares of peatland in Finland in 2023. Now, this is just a start. Hopefully this continues, in terms of it was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hectares of peatland that were destroyed. So, there's a long way to go. And this is the main thing, this is the main reason why this is such a good story to highlight in 2023. So this was done in the last year, this wasn't done 10 years ago. We're just now seeing positive effects of it. Prior to 2023, in these lands which had just been turned into grasslands and meadows and maybe some woodlands, there was about 2 or 3 bird species left in these places. You might think, grassland, there might be some animals around, but it had just become an environment with such little biodiversity. Bird species, they are an indicator for the health of the whole environment. So we can safely say that there's very few insects and very few mammals and very few anything else around there. So we're talking in the last year, we've gone from 2 or 3 species of bird to over 200. Over 200. 100 times the amount of bird species biodiversity within a year. That is monumental. That is beyond just crazy. I would have said it probably my best, most optimistic predictions would be to go to 20 bird species. Frankly, I didn't know Finland had 200 species of bird that it could take to these peatlands. Just incredible. And these weren't kind of rewilding projects. These weren't birds that were reintroduced by humans to these areas. If you build it, they will come, as they say. If you rewild and improve these environments, it is amazing how quick that nature can recover. It really can. It really can. So that is the good news, the thing to hold on to in this year, from 2023 to 2024 and just onwards, is that it is possible to make a genuine difference in the environment. It may seem all the time things are just going worse and worse and worse. But this wasn't really, in terms of the scale of projects, this wasn't a massive project. It was decently big. But this wasn't millions and millions of euros of funding poured into this. This was just kind of community community-led projects doing their part, and they managed to improve the biodiversity 100 times within a year. So that is really the thing to hold on to, is that I promise you it is possible for things to get better. The Arctic, it is in a bad place in 2023. The Arctic Report Card, as I said, it's a lot of Fs. As I said, we'll bump that up to a D, because, we want to be optimistic. We'll bump that up to a D. Let's say in the teacher's notes, it's when humans apply themselves, they can do great things, but then just not applying themselves quite as much as they should. And so let's just remember that it is possible to make a difference. Let's support these projects when they come up. If you ever see anything in your area if you ever see a project coming up, try and do something to support it, even if that is just on social media, just commenting nice things. You'd be surprised. Any sort of environmental project, you'd be surprised the amount of people that just instantly go to the negative and just try and shut it down. So if you just lend even just a bit of vocal support to a project, that can make a difference. Enough people lend vocal support to a project, it can help get it approved. But of course, the best thing is to get involved in these kind of projects. And of course, it's politically voting in the kind of people that seek to make a difference. All right. Thank you for joining me on this quick adventure through 2023 in the Arctic. Thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed this as my first long form video for the Arctic Beyond. I hope to keep on doing this. I have many subjects that I'm very passionate about, that I'm excited to talk about. I know the production values are so far pretty minimal. As this goes on, I hope to just keep improving things. But I didn't want to wait till I had the perfect set ready before I started. Just wanted to get started, so bear with me in that. But thank you so much for joining me. Do make sure to give me any feedback that you can think of. I absolutely appreciate it. If there's any ways you think I can improve, please do let me know. And apparently we're supposed to say things like and subscribe. That's all new to me, but hey, I said it now already. And the important thing is that you all stay safe, you all stay happy, and that I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.